A year ago at the time of this video coming out, Kerbal Space Program 2 had its early access release, and it was rough. Wobbly rockets, lack of content, and god-awful PC performance really soured the hype behind this much anticipated game. I was one of the ones really looking forward to it, and I'd even planned on making a video on it back then, but after about 20 or so hours of game time, I just had nothing to say. But when Lucy and I sat down and planned out our videos for this year, I knew I had to go back to it. So, has Kerbal Space Program 2 gotten any better? Let's find out. Now, I am far from a pro Kerbal Space Program player, seeing as I don't have a theoretical degree in physics, so I wanted to start with the swanky new tutorials. The only issue is, I can't access them until I'm in the game. I would really like to see a section here on the main menu, and maybe even the pause screen that's an easily accessible area for newer players. But before I can talk more about the tutorials, let me start a new save. And in doing so, I'm greeted with something new since the last time I played the game, that being Exploration Mode. In quick terms, it adds collectible science, new parts, missions, and a tech tree for a sense of progression, but more on that later. Let's get back to the tutorials. I love the presentation style they went with. It's very on brand, and it can be funny in a very corporate infomercial way, and most importantly, it's simple. That's a good thing because it's able to convey these complex subjects in an easy to understand way, but it does have some issues. For example, during the first tutorial that let me have control, I noticed some of my rocket's parts were just floating in the air, and when it was teaching me to rotate the camera, it was like it wasn't on the right target and would just spin the camera itself and not actually orbit my rocket. So I reloaded my save and it fixed the camera thing, but not the floating parts. Another issue I found was in the tutorial that covers atmospheric heating during re-entry. In one section, they specifically mention a heat shield, but the craft doesn't have one.
Stage will activate a decoupler, dropping the engine and exposing a very important heat shield. Why don't you do that now?
And then all of a sudden, in the very next section, what I assumed was supposed to be the same rocket has a heat shield. Also, in many of the sections, the rocket doesn't have a parachute nose cone, which just felt odd considering that is something they called out in the building phase of the tutorials. Is this a big deal? Not really. A brand new player would probably just move on, but it just leaves the game feeling janky, and that's not the last time I had that feeling either. After refamiliarizing myself with the game's mechanics, I was ready to head into mission control to pick up some contracts so I could earn some science. The first few contracts are relatively simple, like launch a rocket to the height of at least 10 kilometers. Then the next contract gets it up to 70 kilometers. After that, you're given 2 more contracts, with the primary one being establish an orbit around Kerbin, and the secondary being to land your pod in a body of water. They theme that second one as being a sort of buoyancy test for your capsule, but it feels a little out of place considering this would be at minimum your 3rd rocket launch, with a very high chance your first 2 ended up landing in water. Maybe it's because I've been binge watching a bunch of Kerbal Space Program 1 realism mod content, but I really wish these missions and tech tree were structured differently. From the get-go, your launches are manned missions. You don't start out making dumb rockets or even remote-controlled probes because it's very unlikely you'll go directly to that in your research tree, and frankly, there's not any incentive to. There is no penalty for sending a Kerbal out in space to never return. Now, I know this isn't meant to be some career mode, which I really hope is coming, but I am left just a little disappointed with the newly added exploration mode. Is that my fault? Yeah, probably. Don't get me wrong, the game is a lot better than it was when it launched. There is actual content and progression, and the game will actually kind of direct you into doing things rather than you having to come up with everything on your own. But it's also still not the game I have been waiting for. Even looking at the tech tree, you can see the empty space where things like colonies and deep space travel are supposed to be, but those features aren't there yet. I know this is still an early access release, but the game is just now at the point where if it had launched today with the feature set it has, I would say it's in an okay state. But it took a year to get here. So were we too harsh on Kerbal Space Program 2? I don't think so. It launched in a terrible state, and while it's now okay and I can recommend it to existing fans of Kerbal Space Program, it has a really long way to go before I can just flat out say I recommend it. Thank you for watching InputSource. I'm basically a rocket scientist now, so like and subscribe.